On Daf 145 of Shabbat, we get into a question that has become very controversial these days, the question of a woman testifying. You see, back down in the days of the Torah, in the days of the rabbis, thousands of years ago, there really was a tremendous difference between the status of men and women. And this really helped through education. Men tended to be educated, women tended to not be very much. And one of the rules was that women were not allowed to testify in court, that only men could testify in court. But we see on today's daf that we did make some exceptions, that there were certain very dire matters where we would make an exception. We say, we will accept the testimony of a woman on this one particular case. And the case that comes up is the case of a man who died. And if a woman witnessed the man dying, she could testify that she saw him die. And this was very important because, if it was in doubt whether he was dead or not, a guy disappears, we don't know if he dies or not, that means that his wife is still considered to be married. She can't go and remarry somebody else. Really, life becomes frozen. The ability to testify, to know for sure that somebody's dead, is very important. So for this one narrow area, women were allowed to testify, which seems to show that, there is an idea that women can testify. It is possible for a woman to testify, that the Torah makes room for that. If the rabbis can allow it in this one narrow area, then you can ask, well, why isn't it expanded into more areas? And this becomes very relevant now because we really see that the role of men and women has changed drastically vis-a-vis one another. My first legal job, I was working for a woman who had just been selected one of the top 20 lawyers in the state of California. She was just honored in this one magazine naming the top lawyers. And a few years after I left, she wound up leaving that job and becoming this federal judge. So to be able to say that a woman like that, doesn't have the education to be testifying in court, obviously is ludicrous. So, but the question then is, where do we go and bend? Do we say, all right, clearly men and women have changed vis-a-vis one another? Do we then say, therefore, the law should change in accordance with that? Or do we say, yes, the reality's changed on the ground, but that doesn't mean that we change our tradition, because keeping our tradition is a very strong priority for us. And this is something you see debated quite hotly. Like, at what point do we shift our tradition when it makes sense because the world has changed? And at what point do we say that, no, our tradition is something that is incredibly precious and has sustained us until now? And even when the reality may have shifted somewhat, we're not going to leave that tradition. One of the more minor ways that this comes up, but it's something that comes up, is with dress. We don't live in Europe any longer. We live in a very hot climate. And there are those who very much shifted into much more modern dress, into a type of dress that is much more appropriate for the heat that we have, especially now in late July. Others who dress in garb that seems incredibly dated, and with these big fur hats and these black coats. And they'll point to the fact that, keeping our tradition is what has sustained the Jewish people all of this time. This is how we've been dressing for many generations now. And the fact that we're in Israel, it doesn't mean we want to shift that. We want to be staying in the way we are. So we can look at that same question when it comes to the area of women and testimony. And really, it's a much more controversial area here because it's dealing with aspects of law, whereas the dress is just dealing with aspects of tradition. Do we shift our rules and say that, men's and women's education is very balanced these days? Plenty of women are attorneys, plenty of women are judges. The idea that a woman can't give testimony is ludicrous. We say that, but we say, no, we need to adhere to the tradition we've received. And in this area, women are given very narrow exceptions where they can testify. We keep those narrow exceptions, but nothing else. So let me know what you think. Comment below. I'm curious to know, is this an area that you feel like we should be shifting as a Jewish people, or that keeping the tradition is more important?